Hello, I'm Karl Wells. This month marks the 60th anniversary of the assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy in Dallas, Texas. Back in 2009, I wrote a feature article for the Weekend Telegram, which actually made it to the front page. It was called "Where Were You When?" And in this article, I asked many people where they were and how they reacted to news of the assassination of President Kennedy. Most of the interviews were conducted in person or through correspondence. A few were done over the telephone and recorded on cassette audio tape. This one, as a matter of fact. And recently I unearthed this here in my office and had a listen to it. And I found it really interesting because there was stuff there that I had completely forgotten about. The three interviews I found were with the gentleman behind me here. First, Greg Malone, a well-known Newfoundland and Labrador actor, a well-known Canadian actor, and those of you who aren't from Newfoundland and Labrador may recognize Greg as the actor who did such a spot-on impersonation of CBC's Barbara Frum, famous for As It Happens, and then, of course, for The Journal on CBC television. Next is Ron Pumphrey. Ron was a very, very famous open line show host here in St. John's, talk show radio host, a master of the craft. And before that, he was a newspaper publisher and reporter, latterly an author. He passed away a few years ago, sadly. And then we have the late T. Alex Hickman, who was a prominent St. John's lawyer, then a cabinet minister in the Newfoundland and Labrador government, and later in life he became a Chief Justice of the Newfoundland Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals. All of these interviews I think you'll find interesting, and nobody has ever heard them before, and it's my pleasure to play them for you now. So please listen and reflect upon what happened on that day, November 22nd, 1963, 60 years ago, when President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas by Lee Harvey Oswald.
I'm speaking with actor and author Greg Malone. And Greg, tell me what you remember from November 22nd, 1963. Where were you when you heard the news of JFK's death, and how did it unfold for you?
We were, Karl, we were in high school.
Yeah.
And I was sitting in class in Gonzaga High School. And sometime in the afternoon, I guess it was, I suppose it was the afternoon, I can't remember, but Father McKenna, the principal, came over the PA system and announced that President Kennedy had been shot.
Ooh.
And it's all very, grim. And then I remember the teacher in the class made some allusion to the fact that, well, pretty soon now the missiles will be hitting. Right?
Really?
Yes, Well, you never know, but,
Yeah.
You never know, but we might, the atomic bombs might start falling, right?
So he said this to a bunch of 14 and 15-year-olds.
Yeah. Well, that was the age of nuclear terror anyway.
Well,
there were still air raid sirens around,
yeah.
And Walter Cronkite had us scared to death we were going to be vaporized by a bomb, right, in the 20th century and stuff like that, So, no one really took him very seriously. But that was his illusion.
So you were kind of getting the news as it was coming out. You heard that he'd been shot, but that was it.
Yeah. That's right. I guess the principal heard on the news and put it on the PA right away. So we heard pretty well, in school there pretty well after it happened, not too long after it happened, I guess.
Yeah.
But we were all very affected by it, I remember one guy pretending to weep in the corridors and people looking at him like, no.
Yeah.
And so it did give rise, of course, to a lot of discussion, and it was a lot of, though that was the Cold War era, of course, so everyone thought that, but then they realized, no, you're much more likely to be assassinated by your neighbor or your family member than
So the fact that you were in a Jesuit school, and Kennedy was the first Catholic president. I mean, did that make the experience more intense in that particular environment?
It did, because everyone in the school and the Jesuits were very proud of Kennedy, that he had become president and stuff like that. And it was a big thing. The Catholics had sort of broken through the glass ceiling. So that he was shot was, there was a lot of suspicion about it directed towards a lot of areas when he was shot, and a lot of dismay in the Catholic community. Yeah.
So what about you personally? Did you? How did it make you feel?
Well, I felt very unhappy about it. He was an attractive man.
Yeah.
A young, attractive guy, and he seemed to be cool and sort of rational and sensible, and everything that you sort of wanted to see. And so the thought that he wasn't allowed to live by other forces was quite discouraging. But I have to say the death that affected me most at the time was the death of Pope John the 23rd. I really took that to heart. I really liked him a lot. Mm-hmm. So, and they weren't that far apart, but there were two big deaths. Both of them were very big deaths in my high school years there, and around that time. Yeah.
Yeah. So, how did the priests and the teachers in the school react? Were they kind of taking it calmly, or were some of them completely distraught, or did you notice?
They were pretty sober.
Yeah.
About it, really, and this was that's all I remember is really that they were fairly sober about it, and that it was a hard world for Catholics out there.
So did they close school, or did school continue and then you just ended at the normal time?
School continued
at
the normal time. We used to change classes for periods. We walked through the next classroom and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And so there was a lot of discussion in the hallways and stuff between. And speculation, of course. Yeah.
So they didn't turn radios on so you could hear what was happening, or?
No, it wasn't a baseball game. Karl, let's keep things in perspective.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, the brothers, especially from the American ones, you'd have the radio on all through class during the World Series. It was no question.
Yeah. So would Danny Williams have been in that class at that time? And of course Greg was, or Andy. Yeah.
Mike Harrington and
So all of your experiences would have been the same, basically. You all would have heard at the same time. Yeah.
They maybe I don't know if I've remembered it exactly. They might have a slightly different.
Yeah.
But I think that's pretty well what happened. And
right.
It was, Mr. Michael's class that we were actually in doing French. It was because he was a French teacher.
Yeah. Well, it would have been in the afternoon, I think. Yeah, because I think it happened around lunchtime in Texas, and so that would have been in the afternoon.
Because his class, the French class, was in the afternoon. That's right. Yeah. So it was definitely then. Yeah. It would be interesting to ask other people in the same class to see if they had the same memories.
Yes, that's right. Yes, it's funny, because I remember it happening, and I mean I have my own recollection at what I think.
Yeah. Were you in school?
Oh yes, yeah. I was in school at Holloway.
Yeah.
And I remember my homeroom teacher was a lady named Lima Davis, tall, thin lady, and I believe she was reading David Copperfield to us. And a knock came to the door, and it was the headmistress, a lady named Sophie Edgecombe.
Oh, yeah.
And there was some whispering at the door, and then they both came in together and looked very somber, very, very serious. And Miss Davis said Miss Edgecombe has something she'd like to say to the class, and then she made the announcement that they had just received the news that the President of the United States, President Kennedy, had been killed, and that school was being closed.
Oh, really?
And she said, all of you who are normally picked up by your parents, we've called them, and they're outside waiting for you.
Right.
So I went outside, and I saw my dad's Comet station wagon parked on Longs Hill.
Yeah.
And ran over, and then we drove home, and we lived over our store there.
You were still living on Mount Royal Avenue then?
Yeah, and then we went up to, I ran up the stairs to our apartment, and you entered the living room right away, and the old Westinghouse black and white was on in the corner, and I saw Walter Cronkite.
Oh, yeah.
Doing the coverage, And then it seemed that for 3 days, that's all we did was watch television. And I remember sitting with,
definitely. I watched every minute of it.
Yeah, it was like wall-to-wall coverage. And I remember vividly sitting with my dad watching television when Lee Harvey Oswald was shot.
Yes.
Because they went to these live cameras, and they showed Oswald coming out, he was going to be transferred from one jail to another. And then all of a sudden, look, bang, bang, Oswald's been shot. So it was, I remember that so clearly. Okay, I'm speaking with author, journalist, and former broadcaster Ron Pumphrey. Ron, what are your recollections of November 22nd, 1963, when you first heard the news that President Kennedy had been assassinated?
Well, Karl, without, having to sit down and ponder the question, let me say I was in my office on the third story of the Empire Building, that which was called the Empire Building at the corner of Duckworth Street and the hill there, Granny Bates Hill.
Right.
And I was publishing a Belle Island newspaper and a Mount Pearl newspaper, both of which were being done on the latest in mimeography, which allowed me to publish pictures. And I was at my machine with my printer's apron on, the reporter, editor, and all that kind of thing, salesman, when it came on the news on a little radio on the wall, on a little shelf on the wall, and I sat down in utter disbelief. I was shocked beyond measure. The fact that you would ask me that question and for me to answer right away like that would tell you that I was so shocked. I know exactly where I was.
Yeah.
And my God, I looked out the window and I saw cars parking. I saw people getting out of cars and talking, and inviting pedestrians to hear their car radio, and I went across the street to the barber. I forget the name of the barber.
Yeah.
He had fallen off the ladder. He was up doing a roof above his roof and had fallen off, and I went over to see him, and he was there, and he said, "Ron, I'm in more pain now with this knowledge of the President Kennedy having been shot, that I'm just in more pain now than I was when I fell off that ladder." I remember.
Is that what caused him to fall off?
Oh, no. He had fallen off some weeks before.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
And we sat there, and I said, "My God, boy, let's go to the tavern next door."
Yeah.
And we did. We went to the tavern next door, Karl, and we sat down and we ordered a few beers. He, the barber, and me, the printer and editor, and all. And we sat there, and the people began coming in, and there was a hubbub of conversation and disbelief. And I remember my sister Mary having said to me something which I never forgot when I visited her that afternoon. She said, I think God took President Kennedy away because, he was such a good man that he might have been in a position to sin, and therefore and therefore be punished eternally. So God took him away. And I said, Mary, don't be so foolish.
Yeah.
And that was it. And there you have it.
Ron, just before you go, this is something I've been asking people. I mean, here we are. We're living in Newfoundland. We're in Canada. We're in a different country, and yet on that day, when news came that a U.S. president had been shot, everything sort of came to a standstill. Schools closed. People left work and went home. Why do you think that was?
Well, we loved him.
Yeah.
He was distinctively different. He was a brave man who stood up against Khrushchev at the time when Russia was going to send missiles down to Cuba.
That's right.
Cuba had become communist under the new revolutionary Castro.
Yeah.
And they were going to arm themselves. Russia was going to protect itself, if you like, from the Americans by having these long-range missiles established in Cuba. And now Kennedy had to make up his mind: would he accost the Russian ships coming south and tell them to turn around? Would he do it? And he did do it. He did do that. This could have led to a nuclear holocaust. But he had to take. He felt he had to take that chance. He took that chance. And of course, he was famous for these things and his having been a war hero. And of course, the Kennedys, the family, the dynasty, was well known internationally from the time Kennedy's father had been the ambassador for the United States over in England years and years before, to Kennedy having been on a gunship and jumped into the seas to save one of his buddies during the war. Right on through, the Kennedys, well, I mean, they were the kings. They were the, they were the people. They were the movie stars. Yeah. They were everything.
And as I recall, within a couple of days, everything seemed to be sort of unraveling, spiraling out of control when Lee Harvey Oswald was shot.
Yes, by Ruby.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you yourself believe that there was a conspiracy, or that Oswald was just this lone kook who had done this terrible thing?
I at the time didn't know what to think. Was he alone? I mean, this was a question asked by the world at that time.
Yeah.
Was he alone? Was he acting in behalf of the Russians, perhaps? What? And so I, being a journalist, said, well, I'll hold my humble opinion, because I don't have enough information to have more than a humble opinion. I'll hold that until I see what the investigation shows.
Right, yeah.
And of course the investigation showed he was acting alone.
Yeah.
When something of major proportion happens, there are all kinds of rumors. Like, for instance, now, the current one, the one which has been current for the past year or so, remember the two planes that crashed into the huge buildings there in the United States?
The 9/11?
The 9/11 thing. Well, the current theory is that this was set up perhaps by the CIA or somebody, some group like that, because the buildings came down as if they had been imploded.
Right, exactly, yeah.
And so there's, they did this in order to sanction any war that the president might want to start.
Yeah.
And, you have it all. You have it all. But
That's right.
I don't believe this, by the way, but this is the current thing. Yeah. With every major disaster comes a bunch of theories which are often off the wall. I thought I believe the one about the 9/11 situation is off the wall. The Kennedy one, I can accept that Oswald acted alone.
Yeah. And certainly his own family did. I believe they accepted that it was a lone gunman.
Yes.
Anyway, Ron, thank you very much for this.
A pleasure.
It was lovely chatting with you again.
A pleasure, Karl.
Okay.
God bless.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I'm speaking with the Honorable T. Alex Hickman, former Chief Justice of the Trial Division of the Supreme Court of Newfoundland and former Cabinet Minister in the government of Newfoundland and Labrador. And Mr. Hickman, can we go back to November 22nd, 1963? Where were you, and how were you informed of the assassination of U.S. President John F. Kennedy?
I was working in my law office on Duckworth Street in St. John's when my secretary came in with tears streaming down her cheeks to tell me that President Kennedy had just been shot. And I remember it vividly. I remember it was a very somber day. My recollection was that it was Friday afternoon.
Mm-hmm. And what was your reaction?
Well, you know, my reaction, I guess, like most, was one of, in the beginning, disbelief. And then when I went home, you know, the drama continued to play itself out during the next 2 or 3 days. I can recall going home and, of course, watching the assassination and then the swearing in of Lyndon Johnson on the plane as he was being transported to Washington, and Mrs. Kennedy with blood stains on her, as I recall it, pink suit, standing by as he was being sworn in as president. And you know, that everything was all the drama continued to unfold. And then, if you recall, on Sunday afternoon, when Lee Oswald was being moved from his detention place to another correctional facility.
To a more secure facility,
right,
presumably.
Yeah, surrounded by police. Out of the crowd came this man, Ruby, and shot him dead right there, which, you know, compounded the problem, and I think it increased the fear and the suspicion that Oswald was part of a plot, which, of course, the Warren Commission did not find any evidence to sustain that. And then there was the funeral in Washington with all the heads of state. I could see de Gaulle and Prime Minister Macmillan walking behind the casket, and John Kennedy was about 4 years old, standing on the sidewalk saluting as they went by. So it was a very disturbing, sad occasion where people were, you know, we just gotten through, or not long before, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
That's right, yeah.
And everyone was concerned that with the death of President Kennedy and the new kind of leadership that he was capable of giving the United States, that the Cold War would heighten and that we might be on the verge of a major confrontation.
One thing which I've always found curious, I mean, we're living in Newfoundland. We're in a different country. We're not Americans, and yet on that day, if memory serves, once the word came, schools closed, and people left work and went home. Why such a strong reaction to the death of a United States president?
Well, number one, I guess there hadn't been a United States president shot and murdered while he's in office since either Lincoln or McKinley. And apart from that, John Kennedy, as a young president, had captured the imagination of the world, and also his recent confrontation with the Russians over Cuba had shown him to be a leader of what was then termed to be the free world. And all of this was so new and so horrible that I think people couldn't think of anything they should do other than go home and and watch it on television and watch it unfold. And it was, I know our office was empty within, I'm sure, a half an hour after we got the news.
And of course, you mentioned television. I guess he really was the first United States president that got tremendous television coverage, because television was just starting around the same time.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think that, he owed his election to a large extent to his skill in manipulating, for want of a better word, television. If you remember the debates between he and Nixon, and Nixon was ahead in the polls until the television debate.
Yeah.
And that media is so penetrating that just the expressions on their faces, the confident young John F. Kennedy debating Richard Nixon, who you could see was uncomfortable in the spotlight and somewhat nervous. And a lot of historians claim or suggest that that's when the tide turned in front of Kennedy, in favor of Kennedy, because he only won by a very, very small margin.
That's right. Yeah. Well, Mr. Hickman, this has been wonderful. Thank you for telling me how you found out about the death of President Kennedy. I appreciate it very much.
It's nice hearing from you.
Okay.
One of the penalties I pay is being an endangered species. Every once in a while someone calls and says, "Can you remember?" And I can.
Well, we're lucky that there are people like you around who can recount these stories.
You're very welcome.